So now we're going to switch to creative differences. Because we've talked about combat, I think it's probably best if we talk about the very differences between a open system with fast dynamics like NycosRPG and the more classic or traditional RPGs. I'm not going to be focusing in particular on a game system, although the one with which I have the greatest experience is 50 Years Behind the Shield as a game master for Dungeons and Dragons. So the first thing we're going to talk about before we get into the actual issues of combat that apply to damages, wounds, and injuries, we're going to talk first off about the equivocation dilemma that is inherent in role-playing games across the board. In most game systems, the type of damage that a person presents to the enemy is generally not defined. There are ways to do so. You can utilize the weapons class mechanism, so you look at it as a bludgeoning weapon or a slashing weapon or a piercing weapon. Or you can look at it from a speed factor, pole arms being much slower than, say, knives. There are a whole lot of different ways to look at equivocation of damage. Furthermore, when you add magic in, when you hit somebody with a magical effect, what is the kind of damage? Now, Dungeons and Dragons has a panoply, and that's just that one example. But the idea here is that the equivocation dilemma has more to do with the fact that you're tracking all of those points under the umbrella of life points, and therefore the restriction or reduction of a person's ability to play is tied to this loss of points. And most mechanisms, most classic roleplay mechanisms, don't have any limits until you hit the zero, and until you actually run out. When you have hit the zero, then things change. But the process by which they got there and what kind of damage they took and whether or not they could resist that damage quite often isn't even bothered with. It's take your hit points of damage, and this is what I get to do this much, and then I get to do this additional amount for being sneaky, and I get to do this extra points of damage because of the magic on my weapon. And all told, you're still compiling them all together and subtracting them from the enemy's hit points. So mechanically, there's not much that gives a clarity. So this equivocation dilemma that you're wanting to have everything under one umbrella, but it makes all of them more difficult to deal with in the crunchiness, really does affect the way the game plays. And this comes down to the phrase that I've got here next, and that is damage type matters. If, for example, you were using the classic monster troll, just about everybody on the planet that has ever played any roleplay games whatsoever simply knows that fire damage is more devastating to the troll than other types of damage. Now, generally, there's no rules in the description of combat that differentiates those, other than to say, for example, damage by fire can't be regenerated or whatever. But going back to the equivocation dilemma, the fact that damage type isn't really pressed on really causes you to have either one of two choices. The dilemma here is that if you go to pursuing the damage type more tightly, then you're creating an even more staggered amount of things that you have to track in a combat phase or in a combat round, and therefore you have to expand the amount of time you spend in that conflict. Furthermore, the concept of that damage being dealt doesn't take into account things like the type of armor that you're wearing. You know, if someone is going to light you on fire, metal armor actually would be pretty helpful, especially early on, but it's only during increasing numbers of rounds of damage that now the armor actually becomes a deficit because it's now heated to the point where it's dealing damage in addition. But these are all things that are not covered in most roleplay games. You just simply shine that part and just have all the damage points accrue against a single damage pool. This is really problematic when you look at combat from a slightly different angle, and that is, what does armor really do? In traditional role-play games, it provides a increase in the difficulty of being hit, which is kind of silly. That's like saying if I wear a barn over my body, I got less likely chance of being hit because I'm inside the barn. But you can't wear the barn as your body, and wearing armor doesn't necessarily mean you're harder to hit. It may mean some reduction. Arguably, the armor really should mitigate or ameliorate the damage coming in by the very type of armor that it is. And while some individual game masters pick up on this and develop their own homebrew equivalent, nonetheless, most roleplay games simply count armor as a reduction in the amount of potential you have to actually hit them. So their armor class gets higher, your weapons improvements don't overcome that, and therefore they are in better protected status simply because you can't deal any damage to them. But that's not what armor does. Armor actually, as I said, can be an ameliorating factor. It can actually reduce or even forestall damage that would be done based on the type of damage that would be created. And so, unlike those other mechanisms, the NycosRPG actually breaks out armor by type and then determines which armor type reduces which kind of damage the best, and therefore you can get a better feel for what the armor is actually doing. And yes, there are possibilities of actually stacking your armor, wearing full plate armor over the outside of a gambeson, which is wrapped over your brigantine over your gambeson. So sure, you can have multiple layers of armor, and each one of them gets its effect. But these lead to other issues, because if you're wearing more than one suit of armor, if you're wearing 2 or 3 sets of armor, you're making yourself naturally less effective unless you've actually trained in that multi-armored status. So once again, you can specialize and build up your modifiers, or you can choose to stay with one of the lowered armor types, and gain points more rapidly. But this is why in the Nykos mechanism, the style matters, so that not only with the weapon that you're using, but the very type of armor you might have been trained in makes a difference. So you can actually alter the combat values by skill in dealing with the very things you have. I was watching a video sequence some time ago wherein they were comparing the armor of a fireman and the armor of a police officer and the armor of a knight. And what they were trying to show is that with proper training and proper understanding of the value and the way of using the armor, that guy in plate armor is just as effective, even though the weight of the armor might be a little bit higher. And these are all evidence that the style a person plays and the style that they take in terms of combat really does matter. And with role-playing in the classic sense, when you're just racking up damage against the hit points, armor doesn't do anything to reduce that whatsoever. If the person succeeds in their hit, they get to add their modifiers, and that's the damage that is done. And this mechanism instead reflects that even with the best of styles, if you're using a weapon against which the armor is a perfect defense, then you are going to be reducing the effectiveness of the attacks against you. Hence the use of conditional modifiers instead of damage dealing. That really lets the player choose how they want the fights to go. Now, in traditional roleplay games, the fights generally only end when the monster has been reduced to 0 hit points. And that can be, of course, modified if the game master is using additional rules for how they can mediate the damage that they're being done, or perhaps they're given a ferocity that allows them to fight beyond 0. But the biggest challenge is that there are very, very few other ways to end a conflict that aren't just executive order by the director. If the game master says it happens, it happens, but really that doesn't leave much in terms of satisfaction for the players, because they had to basically wait for the game master to give the fight permission to end. Well, in the Nikos mechanism, because we're using a contested die rolling mechanism, you're rolling against your style in attack, and I'm rolling against my style in defense. The winner determines the end of the conflict if the opponent loses. Now, if you are of equal skill and fighting in equitable terrain, the fight could range all over and take, several dozen rounds, but it will end whenever one player gets a success and the other a failure. It's just mathematical equivalence. There's going to happen. And the way in which the fight ends is allowed again to the successful person to determine what conditions he wants to put on the opponent at the end of the fight. The nuance here is that in classical Dungeons and Dragons, all creatures attack and defend with the same ferocity. So there's not a mechanism for providing the monster to be more animalistic or ferocious, unless that monster specifically had a write-up. And of course, there's always going to be a exception that breaks the rule. But what I want to talk about is that the Nikos mechanism, in contrast, provides monstrous motivation separate from the motivation of an opportunistic villain or even just somebody you're sparring with. The monstrosity's motivation is always to deal damage and to destroy. So if it has the opportunity to do those things, that's what it's going to attempt to do. And by having it so that the players can see those enemies which are monstrous and be able to differentiate them from those that have a more conscientious approach, allows them to do things like negotiate, try to cajole or convince the opponent to cease the fight in advance. Now, this really comes down to what you're looking for in a role-play game. Some people step into role-play with the idea of, I'm playing the game, I'm playing by the rules, and I want to use all of the rules to the best effect I can, and therefore the fight will seem more realistic. And to me, that's a challenge, because that level of realism does tend to slow the combat sequences way down. And so by having instead a dramatic outcome, utilizing conditions and focusing upon the skills that the persona brings to the combat, allow for a much more rapid play and more effective combat scene than they might otherwise.